As I promised at the end of our last lecture, now the time has come to talk a bit about the bishop e3 line and a classical variation. Why bishop e3 line? Because it is a line which is getting excessively popular lately, and if you will start to play this opening, this is certainly the line you will face very often. So it is worth taking a closer look at it. So the first initial moves are the same, like in my game against Atalik, and here after e5, bishop e3, which is undoubtedly a logical move, as we know White's main structural problem in this opening is the square d4. As I mentioned earlier, usually White tries to solve this problem either by taking on e5 or moving the pawn to d5, or, as in this case, by just defending this pawn yet another time and developing the piece harmoniously and seeing what is going on. And basically the thing about this position, as in many other systems in King's Indian, is that black, after White chooses the subsystem, black still has a variety of options. In this position, after bishop e3, there is, for instance, a move, knight g4, one of the most popular moves, to clarify immediately the situation with this bishop, after which the bishop usually has to go to g5, because the exchange of this bishop on e3 would be pretty bad for White, and black continues to chase the bishop with f6. And this is basically a method of trying to create the counterplay immediately. The drawback of this being that black's queen side is still undeveloped, and sometimes it might be strategically risky to get into immediate battle when the whole queen side is still standing still there. The other option would be, in my opinion, strategically more sound option, to develop the queen side with knight a6, castles. Also, as before, White cannot just take the pawn on e5 after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen d8, rook d8, knight e5, because knight e4 simply wins it back with a pretty equal ending. So knight a6 castles, and a very decent, very strategical, very positional move is c6. The point of this being is that usually black has a very firm command of dark squares in this opening. His bishop on g7 exercising some pressure on White's center, and the pawns on d6 and e5 also controlling number of major squares. And with move c6, black also wants to show that he continues to fight also for light squares, for d5 and b5, and that is also displaying that it is a harmonious setup black is striving for, and not just some sharp immediate kingside attack. Here, as in many other lines in King's Indian, black basically has all the squares on the fifth rank controlled. a5 is controlled by the queen, b5, c5, d5, e5, f5 and h5 are controlled by black's pawns. So in fact, strategically speaking, nothing can be seriously wrong with black's setup. But just putting the knight on a6 and not on e7 or d7 as in the classical line basically shows that here in this setup black just goes for long positional battle. And what can ensue from this position is either, and this makes a very principal difference, the position after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen d8, rook d8. This ending, which, as I mentioned in my very first introduction to King's Indian in our first lecture, bears a certain strategic danger for white, because if white doesn't develop some initiative usually connected with the plan of playing a3, b4, c5, and then trying to occupy the square on d6, preferably with his knight, then in the long run, if he does not succeed, he will get into trouble, because sooner or later the weakness of the square d4 will begin to tell. And recently there was a great game played by Kozhul with black against Bilavsky, where he managed to beat Bilavsky with black in this position in the most classical fashion. The bishop came to c5, these bishops were exchanged, the knight came to d4, this knight came to f4, and just white was squeezed to death, and even the player of Bilavsky's caliber could not do very much against it. So one should remember that this is not a safe way for white to make a quiet draw. It is just a strategic fight where still a lot is going on. And the move d5 is still a different story. After d5, knight g4, bishop g5, for instance, f6. Here bishop can go to d2 to h4, but let's say bishop h4, c5. Another fairly important structure arises. We, in classical variation, we saw this structure with the pawn on c7. With the pawn on c5, the major difference is that white will find the plan with a3, b4 much more difficult. And also, when white achieves a3, b4, for instance, after, I do not know, knight e1, knight h6, a3, then continues with b4, knight d3, black will usually play b6, it is not clear what white has achieved. And it is important to remember that in this structure, principally, white can only achieve something by the eventual sacrifice on c5. So normally a knight would be sacrificed, leaving white with 2 pawns for a piece and some initiative and a very complex battle, whilst black will be trying as usual to develop some initiative on the king side. And there are also other options. For instance, e takes d4 is a pretty unusual option for King's Indian, but pretty normal in this particular position, trying to get some counterplay after knight d4, rook e8, f3, c6, followed by d5 later on. And all this is basically to show you the variety of ideas available to you in this opening, that basically according to your taste, amount of knowledge in certain line, you can basically choose from really many possible ways of playing this with black. And that basically the general idea that just black just tries to go f5, f4 and mate is, although correct, is still not the only way to see and play this opening. That basically lots of also purely positional methods are possible. And after bishop e3, also Kasparov in his match against Kampov tried some very unusual and now considered fairly dubious ways, like systems with queen e7 and something of the kind. And there are other ways to play the system as well. And in my game against Sashikiran in the World Cup 2002, in the game which had a very serious importance, because I really had to win this game with black in order to qualify for the next stage of the World Cup, when facing this position with black, I had to decide whether I go for some of the main lines, for some positional lines, for some sharper lines. I decided to use the nowadays almost unknown, considered dubious line invented some 20 years ago by English player John Nunn, who played King's Indian throughout his career, and he played back in '88 in the World Cup against Kasparov and against some other players. A very strange looking move, H6. And the ideas of this move and of the ensuing position I will explain you on the practical example on this game against Sashi Kiran in the World Cup in our next lecture.